Hey everyone, welcome back. We all know staying ahead of the curve is key, right? Especially when you're prepping for something as demanding as the UPSC exams.
Absolutely.
And today, we're diving into a topic that's making some serious waves in India's strategic circles. Uh, the buzz is all about India's move to formalize its approach to military space. We're talking about a dedicated military space doctrine and even a national military space policy.
This is huge. It's a clear signal that India is recognizing the rapidly growing importance of space, not just for, communication or scientific research, but as a critical domain for national security.
Exactly. And to really unpack this, we're going to be drawing on a recent report from the Hindu. It's got some really insightful analysis on this whole development. And what we really want to do today is understand a few key things, right? Why is India focusing on this now? What's driving this shift? And what are some of the concrete steps that have been taken so far?
Sounds good.
So one of the things that the Hindu really emphasizes is this idea that we're at this, pivotal moment, this cusp of an era, as they put it, where space is becoming, a potential battleground.
Yeah. A lot of experts are calling it the fifth operational domain alongside land, sea, air, and cyberspace. So it's not just about, launching satellites anymore. It's about securing our assets in space and being prepared for potential threats.
Okay, so let's get into that then. Why is India prioritizing this right now? I mean, there's always been military activity in space, right, since Sputnik in 1957. So what's changed?
Well, a big part of the answer lies in the increasing global anxiety about the militarization and potential weaponization of space. I mean, just look at the UN Security Council resolution from April 2024, the one that the US and Japan proposed.
Right, the one aimed at preventing an arms race in space.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what happened? Russia vetoed it.
Yeah, that was a pretty clear indication that getting everyone on the same page about responsible behavior in space, it's a real challenge.
It is. And it's not just that incident, right? The UN has been calling for a legally binding instrument to prevent the weaponization of space for years now. But major powers like Russia and China, they just haven't been on board.
So that basically means we're looking at an increasingly unregulated environment in space.
Pretty much. And that's a serious concern because the technology is advancing at such a rapid pace. We're talking about things like potential nuclear ASAT weapons.
ASAT meaning anti-satellite.
Right, anti-satellite weapons. And if those become a reality, well, the consequences could be absolutely devastating. Not just for military targets, but potentially for global communications and all kinds of civilian infrastructure that relies on space-based systems.
It's kind of a scary thought, right? Like this stuff isn't just science fiction anymore.
Yep, it's very real. And that's why countries like the US and Russia, they've already gone ahead and established their own space forces and developed their own space doctrines.
So it's like everyone's kind of preparing for the worst case scenario while simultaneously trying to figure out, how to avoid it.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance. And the lack of global consensus on responsible behavior, well, it just makes it that much harder. I mean, even the 2023 Working Group report on reducing space threats, it couldn't even reach a consensus. That's a pretty clear sign of how deep the mistrust runs between these major players.
Yeah, it definitely paints a pretty complex picture of the global landscape.
Yeah.
And speaking of complex, how does India's own geopolitical situation play into all of this? Because the Hindu specifically mentions growing tensions with China and Pakistan, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, those tensions are a major driver behind India's move to develop this military space doctrine. China's been making some pretty significant strides in space technology lately, things like the Space Silk Road, which has a lot of people concerned.
The Space Silk Road is about what again?
So it's basically China's ambitious plan to build a network of space infrastructure, including satellites, navigation systems, and even a potential space station. And while they claim it's mainly for peaceful purposes, well, a lot of analysts see it as a way for China to, project its power and influence globally.
I see. And on top of that, you've got the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, right? They've actually restructured their forces to include dedicated aerospace and cyberspace commands.
Yeah, that's right. That happened a few years ago. And from India's perspective, well, it's seen as a very direct and serious security challenge. I mean, it signals that China is very actively and intentionally militarizing space. And so that's pushing India to develop its own capabilities to, counter those potential threats.
Okay, so we've got these global anxieties about weaponization, and we've got these specific regional tensions with China. But what are some of the other factors that are motivating India to develop this doctrine? Like, what's happening within India itself?
Well, the Hindu points out a few key things. First, the threats to India's space assets, they're just becoming more diverse and more complex. I mean, it's not just about other countries trying to shoot down our satellites.
There are other threats, too.
Right. Absolutely. We're talking about orbital threats like accidental collisions or intentional interference with our satellites. Then there's the risk of attacks from kinetic weapons, basically anything designed to physically destroy a target in space. And of course, there's the whole domain of electronic warfare, where you're trying to disrupt or jam the signals that our satellites rely on.
Oh, and let's not forget cyber attacks, right? I mean, those are a constant threat to any kind of complex system, and space infrastructure is no exception.
Exactly. And so to effectively address this whole spectrum of threats, India needs to build more resilient systems, develop better safeguards, and really enhance its overall space security posture. And that's where a formal military space doctrine comes in.
Right. It's about creating a clear framework for how India is going to operate in space, how it's going to defend its interests, and how it's going to respond to potential threats.
Exactly. And another important factor is the need for better integration. I mean, India's space program is growing rapidly across all sectors. You've got the civilian side with ISRO, the commercial space industry is booming, and then you've got the increasing military use of space.
Right. And without a clear doctrine, it's easy to see how things could get messy and disorganized.
Absolutely. So this doctrine is also about defining roles and responsibilities, establishing procedures, and making sure that all these different players are working together smoothly and efficiently.
It's about creating a more unified and coherent approach to space.
Right.
Okay, so if we were to sum up the core objectives of these military space operations, what would they be?
Well, the Hindu lays out 3 primary goals. The first and most obvious one is safeguarding India's national security.
Makes sense.
The second is addressing the inherent vulnerabilities of our space-based systems, basically making sure our satellites and other infrastructure are as protected as possible. And the third is proactively tackling those emerging space-based threats that we were talking about earlier.
So it's about being prepared, not just reacting to threats after they occur.
Exactly. It's a much more proactive and strategic approach.
Now, one thing that the Hindu highlights, which I think is important for anyone following India's global image, is that India has always been a strong advocate for the peaceful use of space, right? Like, we've signed a bunch of international treaties.
Oh, absolutely. India has been a signatory to pretty much all the major international agreements on space. You've got the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which is kind of like the foundational document for international space law. Then you've got things like the Rescue Agreement, the Liability Convention, the Registration Convention, even the Moon Agreement.
And those cover things like what?
Well, they establish a framework for responsible behavior in space. Things like not claiming sovereignty over celestial bodies, not placing weapons of mass destruction in space, assisting astronauts in distress, and making sure that countries are liable for any damage caused by their space objects.
It sounds like India has been pretty proactive in terms of supporting international cooperation in space.
Oh, definitely. And beyond those treaties, India is also an active member of the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, or IADC.
What do they do?
They're basically focused on mitigating the problem of space debris, all that junk that's orbiting the Earth. And India's also adopted the 2008 Debris Mitigation Guidelines, which are all about, designing and operating satellites in a way that minimizes the creation of new debris.
So it's about, being a responsible spacefaring nation, right?
Exactly. And all of this is really important because it shows that even as India develops its military space capabilities, it's still committed to upholding international norms and promoting peaceful cooperation in space.
It's about striking that balance.
Right.
Between national security and global responsibility.
Right.
Now, one of the key moments that really showcased India's capabilities in space was the 2019 ASAT test mission Shakti.
Yeah, that was a pretty significant event. I mean, it demonstrated that India has the technology to intercept and destroy a satellite in low Earth orbit, and that put India in a very exclusive club of nations with that capability.
So what was the message behind that test?
Well, officially, India maintained that it wasn't about starting an arms race, but about demonstrating a credible deterrence capability. It was about sending a signal that India takes its space security very seriously and that it's willing and able to protect its interests in space.
And I imagine it also kind of kicked things into high gear in terms of developing this formal military space doctrine.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that test was a real turning point. It really highlighted the need for a more comprehensive and strategic approach to space security.
The Hindu also mentions a couple of organizational steps that India took before the ASAT test, right?
Right.
Like the establishment of the Integrated Space Cell in 2010 and then the Defense Space Agency in 2018.
Yeah, those were important milestones in the lead up to this doctrine. The Integrated Space Cell, it was kind of an initial attempt to bring together the different stakeholders in India's space program, ISRO, the armed forces, the intelligence agencies. It was about improving coordination and starting to think about space security in a more integrated way.
And then the DSA, the Defense Space Agency, that was a bigger step.
It was. That was about formally establishing a dedicated military organization specifically focused on space. And they've been tasked with a lot of important things like drafting this military space doctrine, developing a satellite communication network for the armed forces, and coming up with strategies to counter various space-based threats.
So they've been pretty busy.
Yeah, they have.
Okay, and then you've got the 2023 Indian Space Policy, which I guess kind of sets the stage for all of this.
Right. So the Indian Space Policy, or ISP, it was really the first comprehensive document that laid out India's overall vision for all of its space activities. And that includes, not just the security aspects, but also the scientific, the commercial, and the exploration sides of things.
It's a very broad policy.
It is. But it's interesting because even though it touches on national security, it doesn't really go into a lot of detail. And the Hindu points out that that actually highlights the need for a more focused document like this military space doctrine that we're talking about.
Because the doctrine is going to be specifically about the military aspects of space.
Exactly. It's going to provide those concrete guidelines for how the armed forces are going to operate in space, how they're going to defend our assets, and how they're going to respond to potential threats.
Okay, so the ISP sets the broad framework, and the military space doctrine fills in the operational details for the military side of things.
Right.
Now, one of the details that really jumped out at me from the Hindu's report was this approval for a massive 52-satellite constellation for ISR.
Oh, yeah, that's a big deal.
So ISR, that stands for Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance, right?
Oh, right. It's basically about having eyes and ears in space to monitor what's happening on Earth.
And a 52-satellite constellation, that's a lot of eyes and ears.
It is. It's a significant investment in India's space-based surveillance capabilities. And what's really interesting is that a large chunk of these satellites, 31 of them, are going to be built by the private sector in collaboration with ISR.
So it's a public-private partnership.
Exactly. And that shows how much India is prioritizing the development of its indigenous space industry. And it also highlights the growing recognition that the private sector can play a really crucial role in enhancing India's space capabilities.
So this constellation, it's going to give India a much clearer picture of what's happening, around its borders, in potential conflict zones, and just generally in areas of strategic interest.
Absolutely. And it's also going to enhance India's ability to respond to potential threats, whether it's terrorism or natural disasters or any other kind of security challenge.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the military side of things. But the Hindu also briefly mentions India's efforts in what they call space diplomacy.
Right.
So what does that involve?
Well, it's about using space technology to build relationships with other countries and to promote regional cooperation. A good example is the GS-9 satellite that India launched back in 2017.
The South Asia satellite.
Yeah, that one. It was designed to provide communication and broadcasting services to several South Asian countries, as a gesture of goodwill and regional cooperation.
Except for Pakistan, right?
Right. Pakistan opted out of that one. But the point is that it was a way for India to use its space capabilities for diplomatic purposes.
And beyond that, India's also been increasing its collaboration with other countries in space, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially with Q-Wade members, the U.S., Japan, Australia, and also with France and a number of other countries. And these partnerships, they're all about sharing knowledge, developing technology together, and really just working together to address the common challenges of space security and sustainability.
So it's a recognition that, in space, no one country can really go it alone.
Exactly. It's a global domain, and it requires global cooperation.
Okay, so to wrap things up, the Hindu reports that India's Chief of Defense Staff has announced that this military space doctrine, it's in its final stages, and we should expect it to be released within the next few months.
Yeah, 2 to 3 months is the timeline they're giving.
And on top of that, there's also a national military space policy in development.
Right. So it's clear that India is moving full steam ahead on formalizing its approach to military space operations.
And what does this mean for India's overall strategic posture?
Well, I think it marks a pretty significant shift. It shows that India is no longer content with just being a user of space technology. It wants to be a leader in shaping the future of space security.
And it's about being able to protect India's interests in space, right?
Exactly. And potentially to project power in space if necessary, but it's also about doing all of this responsibly and in a way that contributes to global stability.
Right. It's about finding that balance again.
Right.
So to sum up the key takeaways for all of you, especially those preparing for the UPSC exams, India is taking some major steps to develop a comprehensive and robust approach to military space operations. And this is being driven by a whole range of factors: global anxieties about weaponization, regional tensions with China, and the growing importance of space for India's national security.
Exactly. And understanding all of this is really crucial for anyone who wants to stay informed about current affairs, international relations, and India's evolving strategic landscape. I mean, these are all key topics for the UPSC exams.
Absolutely. And on that note, I'd like to leave you with a thought-provoking question. India has always been a strong advocate for the peaceful use of space, and it's committed to upholding international law. But at the same time, it's developing these advanced military capabilities like ASAT weapons.
It's a tricky situation, right?
It is. So the question is, how can India reconcile these seemingly contradictory goals? How can it balance its commitment to peace with its need to defend its interests in a potentially hostile space environment? It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's something that all of you future policymakers should be thinking about. And for those of you who want to dive deeper into this topic or any other critical issues facing India today, well, we encourage you to like and subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below with any questions or suggestions you might have. Don't forget, all the information we discussed today is based on that recent report from The Hindu, so be sure to check that out for more details. Thanks for joining us.